Engineering, Magic, and Kitsune, Chapter 36, 1,000 Limbs. John did what he did best. All the bile, all the hatred, all the dread and pain and doubt burning him up from the inside. He forced it down into a nice, neat box to be dealt with later, so that he could face this monstrosity. He would endure. He always had. It faded away into the background, along with the screams of the men he mangled, as he focused on this new threat. The beast hardly fit through the doors, as towering as it was beneath its veil of ghostly pale silk. It was solid, more real than the normal nameless he had fought in the past. Shadows still licked at it unnaturally, but it was far more solid, having a thick, darkened carapace under it. The 8 eyes, rather than different flavors of madness, were eerily steady, subtly glowing red as they scanned the battlefield with steady precision, and rather than crude butcher's blades, the 2 front legs were almost elegant scythes. Now that he was looking at it, the beast's chelicera were different too. They were more solid, more like a jagged tri-jaw than anything that fit on a spider. It was curled tight, like a spring, ready to burst into violence at any moment, yet it didn't. It just loomed over the battlefield, slow, deep, rattling breaths, the only sign that it wasn't a corpse itself. It looked over the battlefield, slowly, calmly, with none of its frenzied madness, of its lesses. It looked from Yuki to Rin, then the dead, and then finally to the sea of twitching bodies. Guilt ate at John's stomach, despite the situation, and he felt nauseous as his recent meal fought to come back up. But he managed to swallow his bile back down. Then it looked at him. The shadowy beast stared at him, and he could read the disconcerting amount of emotions in the eyes as it looked him up and down. It looked at him like one might an old acquaintance, and once its gaze lingered on the winged disc, it started to look curious. He looked away, and he shivered, his body finally feeling safe to do so once it was no longer under a predator's gaze. "It's stronger than I expected," Yuki called up, glancing towards John. "It should be far weaker. Something's wrong." He glanced towards her, but only for a moment, unwilling to take his eyes off the monster that was now examining the field of crippled bodies with interest for long. His mind whirred over what Yuki said, before his face settled into a grimace. "You tried to kill it while I wasn't paying attention," he stated. "Yes, it should have been easy, but it was somehow too strong for that," Yuki explained, eyes still locked onto their eerily still and calm adversary. Her monochrome tails twitched in thought as she bore into it, as if a closer look would unravel the mystery. Nameless nests that accumulate extra money can spawn more greater nameless, almost inevitably spawn a civil war in the young hives. But if a greater sections the wealth off for their personal use, they remove it from the overall pool and stop it from spawning more of their ilk, allowing them to instead empower themselves. This behavior is not instinctual, and I've seen no sign of a prior civil wars in how they build the exits to their nests." The world sat heavy in his mind, and he grunted in affirmation. That was worrying. For more than one reason, he doubted they just happened to have lucked into some book describing that particular behavior. No, either this infestation was much older than they anticipated, or someone taught them that. John wasn't sure which idea he hated most. The monster looked at them both one last time, then it twitched. The shadows on it deepened, and it convulsed like a dying animal, maintaining eye contact with them the whole time. John raised his gauntlet and instinctively tried to fire, but it clicked, only formed a little spark rather than a booming lightning bolt. Shit, he was out of air-aspected mana. He fumbled with pockets, hands violently shaking as the creature's shape contorted like it was writhing from within like a burlap sack filled with wild animals. But it suddenly stilled. Thick, inky fluid dripped from its frame, staining the ground beneath it, forming a bubbling pool from which smaller legs reached forth. Eyes widening, John watched in rapt horror as dozens of tarantula-sized spiders spilled from the pool, surging like demons as they swept over the land like a tide. They burned under the sun, the wisps of darkness rolling off them like mist under a noon sun. But they cared not. None moved towards Yuki, but some sped towards Rin. The dragon-blooded Unbound stumbled to her feet, sword held out in front of her, as an aura of hoarfrost formed around her blade. "No!" He seated the heat focus in place, and smote them like an enraged deity. The darkened creatures evaporated like snow tossed into a furnace, the land scorching black beneath them. "Get out of here!" he roared, ignoring the sudden stabbing pain in his throat. "Sensei, John knew that tone. he bellowed over her before she could disagree. "Get to safety before I throw you there myself." Rin's jaw clicked shut, and after a moment of hesitation, she hurried off back towards the river. It was then that the chorus of shrieks and screams, each as guttural and visceral as a man with his hand ingested by a machine, began. John's head whipped around, and the bottom of his stomach dropped out, as he beheld the crowd of men he had laid low being swarmed over by spiders the size of dinner plates, spinning thin strands of webs to hold their quarry down. Oh, they tried to get away. They did. But there was little they could do as shadowy legs knocked weapons away and hauled limbs down. One even managed to stab one dead with a knife, but the swarm didn't care. No, their impaled brethren were ignored entirely, as it bled black all over their captive, the only acknowledgement from their horde being a quick blob of web from 3 or more to hold the offending limb in place. What was he supposed to do? The indecision bogged him down as he raised his gauntlet. How the hell could he get them off? Pretty much everything he could do would just kill the men too. Could he lift them in his telekinetic grasp, crushing the spiders? No, it would take far too long. Perhaps they burned easier than human flesh. It would hurt them more, but surely it was preferable. A pair of brown eyes met his own, wide, terrified. The man had been one of the men in the back ranks, and thus one of the first he maimed so cruelly. His gaze was wild and panicked as he thrashed against his spines, and he shouted at John with a voice full of terror. He couldn't tell what the man said, and it was unclear if it was because he couldn't pick out the words or because there was no logic within the babbling. Both too fast and too slow, a set of 4 long, shadowy spider legs reached out, grabbing him by the lips and prying his jaw wide open, akin to a cruel dentist. He stood, frozen in horror, as another spider took the opportunity to step into the man's mouth and began to cram itself down his throat. Sharp legs dug into his flesh as it pushed itself in, despite seeming like it was an impossibility for it to fit. The spider made it work, contorting in ways more suited to an octopus, as the man began heaving, bits of sick shooting up past the intruder. But it was undeterred as it dug itself in deeper, forcing its way down the man's throat as he choked, only to be followed by a second spider, then a third. Their eyes met again, but they were almost resigned this time, yet sadly pleading. What the fuck was he supposed to do? Could he do anything? He haltingly, shakingly pointed his gauntlet at the thrashing man, even as nausea threatened to overwhelm him. There was one thing he could do. John's aim shook as his thoughts of the unbound, popped and half-cooked body came unbidden to his mind. He had no way to save this man. The only thing he could do was make it so he stopped suffering. So why couldn't he just twitch his fingers and do it? The tax collector's eyes rolled into the back of his head, and he began seizing and foaming at the mouth. Any sense of organized struggle long forgotten as he mindlessly thrashed against his spines. Writhing, he spun to the side, body contorting in a way that dislocated one of his shoulders with a sickening pop. Then he went stone still. John's arm crashed down to his side, and he was racked with a sobbing cry before he buried it deep down inside. He was a failure. He killed a man out of fear, and then, when his death was a mercy, he was too cowardly to do it. The body twitched to life once more, and its shadowy tendons undid its bindings, even as it began to melt in the harsh sunlight, globs of blackness falling off them in wriggling chunks that shortly turned to mist. They rose as one, like puppets dangling on silken strings. How did John forget about the rest of the group? He barely stopped himself from heaving at the sight of all the corpses standing up, entirely ignoring the previous crippled wounds he inflicted minutes before. No. Whatever propelled him now was not just mere muscle. A quick glance revealed the greater nameless was still in place, and Yuki, she crouched over the bisector form of Rin's opponent, panting heavily. At least he assumed it was the dead body until it twitched, a weak limb reaching forward to drag itself away. Was it being puppeted? No. Why would they infest something with no legs? A chill raced up his spine. The man, somehow, was still holding on to life. Just how tough was the unbound? Yuki planted a paw on his back, forcing him face down into the dirt. Crouching down low, she traced a hand up his back, claw barely grazing his flesh. She less punched through his flesh and more pressed her hand into it, parting it like sand as he began to squirm below her. little blood leaking to the surface, given how much he had lost already. A moment later, she yanked her hand free, revealing a small sphere, which she quickly swallowed. Almost at once, Yuki stood straighter, and her eyes shot back up, far more alert as she scanned the area, looking over the nameless and the group of walking corpses with a dispassionate, analytical gaze, before finally landing on him, softening into something gentle. "John," Yuki said, voice steady and even. "Focus. You can get through this. We'll talk later." There was nothing else to say. This was do or die. So why were John's hands still shaking so much? He grabbed his gauntlet wrist and held it steady, breathing deeply to calm his racing heart. Welcome, interloper, adversary, croaked the sing-song voice far too deep for that tone to fit. "This meeting is overdue," another voice continued. Spinning around, he beheld the corpses. No, the puppets. They looked at both him and Yuki, their numbers split evenly. Somehow, they looked more lively than they did a moment ago, like their puppeteers had repaired them from the inside. Even the burns upon their legs began to fade, although the skin around the area looked almost hollow. Light barely passed through translucent papyrus skin before darkening back to more natural colors a moment later. Sickness threatened to race up his throat as John realized that they were already hollowed out from the inside. Mere moments were all it took. And what was that if he called him adversary? He assumed Yuki was the interloper because she had only shown up recently. Deep black clouds suddenly rolled in above, casting them in an uncomfortable murk. Yet the creature's eyes cut through it with ease, and he swore he saw that same uncomfortable gleam in its puppets as well. Yuki, however, saw an opportunity. He could see it in her stance as she flicked between watching the Nameless and its puppets. "You welcome us, Nameless, despite my claws against the flesh and your proxies being laid low. You are both good sparring partners," the beast responded with a third puppet, its voice wabbling. It wore a young man no older than 19 as a mask, and even had the gall to smile with his stolen lips. "But I only learned so much from my lessons, and a puppet would never get close enough." Something about the answer unsettled Yuki, and one of her tails gnashed. "That is one of the first abilities your kind tend to master, no?" she inquired. "You already know enough to prevent the birth of siblings, who may threaten your command, but not enough to peer through the eyes of your lesser siblings." The spider waved off her question, and one of the puppets responded in turn, but it was stiff, robotic. "There is plenty of time for learning later." John may not be socially adept, but he could recognize the deflection. There was no mistaking it. The answer to why something was the yokai didn't want them to know. Perhaps about who taught it. Perhaps there was something other greatest Nameless before it, and it upset them somehow. That would track. But it felt like he was still missing something important. "What do you even want?" John found himself spitting. "All these lives destroyed. All these people hurt. What was it all for?" That smile. That damned smile. Never left the creature's stolid face. "I want to live, to grow. This world hates my kind, and I must gather powers to survive. You have been a great teacher. There are few places to clash against another without risk, so I must thank you." His eyes narrowed, and sweat beaded upon his brow. No, that couldn't be it. Dread pulled in his gut along with white-hot, simmering anger that slowly bubbled up to the back of his throat like an all-too-familiar companion. All this time, it had been sparring with him. The years he dealt with the Nameless. He's been the toy of some fucking monster who killed, who stole bodies, who destroyed lives. Just so. A scream tore from his throat as blazing hot heat shot from his finger towards the Nameless, blackening the webs but doing little damage through the beast's icus. The only reason he didn't empty the entirety of his fire aspect of mana at once was that his heat focus didn't have the massive throughput of the lightning beam. It was still enough to intensely ignite the grass underneath the creature into a small brush fire and blacken the stones below. It moved fast, far too fast, duking out of the beam as he tried to track it, but it reared up, a ball of webbing extruding from its spinnerets. Eyes widening, he turned off the disk's speed limiter and juked it to the side, just getting out of the way before a massive net tore through the space he just occupied with shrieking noise. John aimed to fire again, but hesitated as Yuki soared into the air behind her with a mighty leap. The air tasted brittle and sour as she called on a power deep within herself. Where it usually felt warm and comforting, this felt acidic and terribly wrong as a lance of light formed on her hand, a mass of solid, sharp-looking white which glowed the sun's blinding radiance, cutting through the sudden gloom of the afternoon. She drove it into the creature's back, the light tearing through the webbing and getting driven against its shadowy mass. But it didn't sink in. The shining light shattered, breaking into a shower of cascading, glittering shards upon the creature's carapace. Darkness swelled from within, and alien dread ripped through him as the creature pulsed with alien darkness. A wave of sheer Stygian blackness threw Kitsune off and into the woods, shattering wood and branches echoing out as she disappeared. "Yuki!" he called, immediately raising his gauntlet to fire a few quick blasts into it, burning away more and more of the silken webbing. "Why, hello there, handsome," a husky feminine voice whispered in his ear, his blood turning to ice as a pale in lavender, almost white, and violet-furred hand held his mouth shut, even as he tried to shout out. He jerked and tried to dodge forward instinctively in sheer panic, but the hand pulled tighter, and several tails with deep purple tips wrapped around his form, hoisting him off his disk and closer to his captor. She was warm, soft, and familiar. John squirmed in her grip and tried to angle his gauntlet to get off a surprise attack on her leg, but her other hand grabbed his fingers and interlaced them with her own, holding them in place and completely stopping him from moving or using it. How? John had hardly used it in front of anybody. No. Whoever the hell this is knows how it works, or at least knows enough to disable him. Who? Blood rushed into his ears, and panic bloomed in his chest as his heart beat like a hummingbird's. Now, none of that, the voice began from somewhere above him. But as she spoke, she leaned in, and he could feel her breath prickling the hairs on the back of his neck. Her tone was calm and honeyed, but his instincts screamed danger, like he was locked in a cage with a tiger. The two of us shall have some time to ourselves. It's the least I can do for you, and you've had so much rough time since you showed up in my backyard. I should have visited you earlier. It's a shame she's gotten her claws into you first. The figure tensed, and her claws dug hard enough into his cheeks that his warding flared to life, stopping him from being cut before she seemed to remember herself and lighten her grip. My apologies, you sweet little thing, she cooed. Call me Kiku. I'm one of Yuki's darling sisters. She paused before laughing, the malicious edge hidden within making his whole body tense. Although, are we really sisters when we were all the same Kitsune once? She mused, fingers idly drumming against his cheek. There are many things Yuki neglected to tell you. End of chapter. I'd quickly like to thank our Tier 5 channel members, Casper Arnholt, John Creighton, Manatharia, 050, Dragzoon WRE, and Elijah Silvercross. Thank you very much.